The two leaders will discuss trade after the close of the G20 summit in Argentina. Well, Professor John Stremlau is the visiting professor of international relations at the Wits University and the former vice president for peace programs at the Carter Center in the United States, and he joins us via Skype. A very good evening to you, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping were set to meet over dinner, and central to their possible chat is the ongoing trade war between the two countries. And worse still, sources report that one of President Donald Trump's hardline advisors on China trade, Peter Navarro, will participate in a Saturday dinner meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Should we be worried?
Well, I think whenever you're talking right now about the United States under the leadership of Donald Trump, there's plenty of reason to be worried. And the way you just presented President Ramaphosa, giving a thoughtful, constructive exposition on what the G20 aspires to accomplish in reforming the international system and modernizing the international system. And it was a very veiled, thinly veiled critique of Donald Trump's unilateralism and his seeming tolerance for world disorder rather than world order. Now, I don't expect that there will be much of substance out of this meeting tonight with Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping and the Chinese government is very well organized. It is proceeding to do some very important work in Africa. Cyril Ramaphosa alluded to that with regard to South Africa's interest in the infrastructure. But bear in mind that it is an authoritarian regime, and what Cyril Ramaphosa did not speak to is that there is within the international system, and particularly between China and the U.S., not Donald Trump's U.S., but the American historic role in the world has been to advance democracy. And I think one of the reasons South Africa is so important in the G20 is that it is not only for multilateralism and it doesn't judge other regimes, but it stands proudly as a truly inclusive democracy. And you see in the two African leaders who are guests at this G20, Macky Sall of Senegal, a democracy, Paul Kagame of Rwanda, an authoritarian regime, but Paul Kagame has just recommended major reforms in the African Union to bring it more in line with the kind of African effectiveness that Cyril Ramaphosa would like to see. So the work of diplomacy is hard, and Donald Trump didn't brief his views on Xi Jinping. We only know what he says from tweets. His own staff can't tell him. There's no ambassador in South Africa to brief the South African government on it. So we just have to hold our breath and hope that there's a better day coming, at least with regard to the U.S. participation.
Professor, I never stop wondering how did China and the U.S. come to this? There's even talks that whosoever wins the U.S.-China trade war is actually the one that loses the least.
Well, there's a backstory to this that I think it's very important for particularly South Africa that plays such a balancing role among different political systems. It gets along very well with China and in normal times very well with the United States. But what is the defining question in the world is whether or not China can replace the U.S. without leading to a world war that is or some sort of a war that has been so typical historically. There have been only 16 or 17 instances where a second power has replaced the first power and done it peacefully. It's in South Africa's interest and in the world's interest to have the U.S.-China relationship be a transitional one. China is going to dominate by far it's going to be the biggest economy in the world. It already is, but it's going to be 50% bigger than the United States by 2024 estimated, or 2030. So that getting that transition right calls for leaders like Cyril Ramaphosa, Modi, others, to try to balance. Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. This is the summit. It picked up.
Well, Well, we seem to be losing Professor John Stremlau. He's the visiting professor of international relations at the Wits University. He is talking about the G20 summit, and of course the big issue, the sticking point of this particular summit is the US and China trade war, which so many analysts believe that, well, China will in the end probably dominate the new world order, and we may be on a cusp of a full-blown trade war between China and the United States, which will, of course, reconfigure globalization. We since have re-established connection with Professor John Stremlau. Professor, I hope you can hear me now. Yeah, please do confirm if you can hear me.
Well, I'd like to just briefly make the point that the rivalry between the U.S. and the Chinese is the defining relationship in the world and will be for the next 20 or 30 years, and that role that the G20 plays, but more particularly South Africa as a friend of both sides, can be extremely important, because obviously we don't want this rivalry to devolve into a conflict, which is the historic example that most often happens when a second power is overtaking a first power. It usually leads to conflict. And so I think that the G20 can play a very constructive role, but unfortunately not with Donald Trump.
Now, alongside the tariffs, the United States has, of course, placed sanctions on a branch of China's military over its purchase of Russian military jets and surface-to-air missiles. Is this perhaps the teething stages of a Cold War?
Well, it's very difficult to predict, because we don't have a coherent U.S. policy or strategy toward Asia or any place else right now. When Obama was president, he was trying to find a way forward, because the U.S. does have real issues with China, and China has real issues with the United States. The question is, can you manage these intelligently and carefully? And that's what Cyril Ramaphosa was speaking to in his call for reform of the international institutions, but also a more active and engaged role for Africa in the transition that lies ahead for all of us. And so it is very important, I think, for Africa to do the reforms that it's proposing to do for the African Union, for Cyril Ramaphosa to speak as he did, but also to call the United States to be more coherent in what it's planning to do. I mean, Trump's advisors did not know whether or not he would cut a deal with Xi Jinping or not tonight. There's been no preparation. He's going to go into that meeting, and we'll see what happens after it's over. But Xi Jinping is a very serious leader with a serious government behind him, with a strategy for advancing Chinese interests. And I don't see how he can take Trump very seriously any more than I think Cyril Ramaphosa takes Trump very seriously. But you should ask him when he comes back from Buenos Aires what he thought of the American role in this conference.
And now, Professor, on the U.S. and Russia, U.S. sanctions have become a permanent feature of Russian economic life. So what is it that Moscow would want to impress upon those who are on the side at the summit?
Well, Moscow has its problems with Europe right now, because Europe is speaking with a united voice. What we don't know, as I've often said, is what kind of financial arrangements exist between Donald Trump and his various economic hotels and other interests and buildings and Russian oligarchs, and indeed Putin himself. That guilty plea by Trump's lawyer indicates that even though Trump was saying he had no financial interest in Russia, he was pushing Trump Tower in Moscow at the very time he was running for president. And that's got to be clarified, in the same vein that his financial interests with the Saudi royal family need to be clarified. As I often say, this is like the Zondo Commission here. When you have a grifter or someone who is more interested in their personal financial arrangements running a democracy, as was unfortunately the case here until recently and is the case now in the United States, you don't really know what the words are that are coming out of the head of state or the leader of the party really mean. There's too much personal interests involved in this mix.
But these sanctions, Professor, must be benefiting some within Moscow. Who are these people, really?
Well, no, the sanctions are targeted against some of the key leaders who may have played a role in the Ukrainian crisis. It is about the Ukrainian crisis. Russia did break the rules of international relations and contemporary international relations as South Africa and everyone else knows when they annexed Crimea as part of, made it part of Russia when it belongs to the independent sovereign state of Ukraine. And now there's tensions escalating and both sides are getting themselves into a corner, and so the Europeans are trying to encourage a negotiated settlement. What Trump feels about this, I don't know. He says he's not meeting with Putin because he is protesting the Ukrainian harassment and interference in Ukraine, but he also didn't change his tune on the meeting until the conviction of his personal attorney, Michael Cohen, for his business dealings with Putin and with the oligarchs. So we just frankly don't know what really is at stake in Donald Trump's interests in this game, but we do know that the United States traditionally has been suspicious of Russian efforts to pressure the neighboring states that got independence when the end of the Soviet Union occurred in the 1990s.
We spoke about the talks on the climate change last night. And which are those countries, Professor, cuddling the United States on this very crucial matter and would do anything not to upset their relationship with Washington?
Well, I don't know how many people are really, how many countries are really feeling that right now. That's one of the really interesting questions is do Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin and Cyril Ramaphosa take Trump at his word, and how do they weight that word? The fact that the United States reneged on its commitments to the global climate change agreement in Paris, and in particular the Green Climate Fund, is very, very dismaying. My guess is that if Trump was to be replaced by another leader, there would be a hasty effort to repair that, because the overwhelming opinion of the American public, not the Trump base, but the majority of Americans, is that climate change is very real. It's causing problems for our planet that must be addressed. And the states and local governments are taking steps, and they would want to be in partnership with the Europeans, with the South Africans, with others who are the vast majority of the international community that's not doing enough, but at least recognizes the problem. Trump denies the problem. That is total, utter nonsense, as 99% of the scientists of the world would agree.
Let's shift our focus now to the Jamal Khashoggi tragedy. Now, this G20 is particularly overshadowed by the recent killing of Jamal Khashoggi inside a Saudi consulate in Turkey. Is this killing perhaps not a corrosive stain that will remain with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, thus constraining him from doing much during and after the summit?
Well, you're very good to raise that point, because it has dominated the world media, and rightly so, because it's not fair to or proper to kill an innocent journalist in an embassy, as happened in Turkey with Jamal Khashoggi. At the same time, this is an American problem, and I was glad that Cyril Ramaphosa did not dwell on this issue. Egregious as it is for the Europeans and for the Americans to pressurize Saudi Arabia, and Donald Trump did shake hands apparently with the Crown Prince in Argentina, did not have a formal meeting. But to her credit, Angela Merkel of Germany did meet with him and apparently told him that this cannot go on until we get to the truth of this matter, and the truth of the matter is now well known and well documented. So it is the fact that Putin and Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, would have a warm embrace and greeting speaks to the strong men over the strong institutions, and that's where the South African voice for strong institutions becomes so important, and one would hope would be joined by other democracies that also value constitutions and the rule of law.
And the G20 summit on the last day, are world leaders looking forward to either a watered-down agreement or absolutely no communique at all?
Oh, they'll have a communique, and as Cyril Ramaphosa indicated, I think there is, don't forget, there's more than just the United States and Russia or the Saudi Arabians at the summit. There are 19 states in the European Union, and the agenda for the summit was to have been on sustainable agriculture, which is a concern of the vast majority of people and countries of the world, and also on cryptocurrencies and other problems that the G20 face. So I think that this is a chance for South Africa to have its voice heard, and they will have a communique tomorrow that will cover this, but the headline news will all be focused on Trump, which is what he may like, but doesn't serve the long-term interests of the rest of us.
All right, Professor, thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate it. That's Professor John Stremlau. He's the visiting professor of international relations at the Wits University and the former vice president for peace programs at the Carter Center in the United States.